co-hosts who are recording us now. So Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders is a book that some of us read together recently. It does have some very interesting things about it. According to the back of the book, Saunders asks, how do we live and love when we know that everything we love must end? It has some entertaining ideas about God and a possible afterlife. It's got a very inventive structure, and I do not recommend that you read it. In fact, I apologize for suggesting it in the first place. I had seen some reviews, I had read a few chapters and said, hey, let's read this together, and did not realize what we were getting ourselves into. We'll get back to the book, Lincoln and the Bardo, in a moment. First, let me talk about when I was first becoming a Unitarian Universalist at the First Church in Columbus, Ohio. The Reverend Dr. Mark Bellatini was the minister at one point and was leading a Seder service at Passover. It was a very meaningful service. He invited those of us who wanted to come into the kitchen of the church. There were maybe a dozen of us sitting around the table there, knowing Mark. All the food that was there was food that he had prepared, and in all the ways that you're supposed to do for a Seder service. When he was the minister in Oakland, before he came to Columbus, he had spent a lot of time getting his spiritual needs with a Jewish congregation out there, and had really demonstrated sympathy with that culture, and had helped lead some things there. And so they had told him he was an honorary Jew because he was so well versed in their customs and traditions. And so he carried that to Columbus with him. I learned so much through his Seder services that it can be a rich seeking peace, that it's not as mysterious and extra rational as one might expect, that it really brings joy and courage and tradition through it. It was really just a lovely service, and I'm very glad I attended those. And I wanted, as I became more and more aware of my own call to ministry, I thought that I would offer similar Seder meals and that similar wisdom. Not that I'm nearly as smart or wise as Mark Bellatini, but that I could learn from him and offer those same gifts of wisdom and peace to the people I serve. My first call was to the Unitarian Universalist congregation of Grand Traverse up in Traverse City, and we had some Seder meals there. There was a break-off, very progressive Jewish congregation that rented space from the UU congregation there. So we were often in the same building, and they would have a Seder and invite some of us. Usually it was in people's homes, and they would invite some of us to their homes. One year in particular, they held it in the church building, in the space they were renting, and they invited the entire congregation to gather with them. And that was a very progressive meal. They had an orange on the Seder plate, for those of you who understand that reference. If you don't, there was a very conservative, curmudgeon-y rabbi at some point who said, a woman belongs to be a rabbi the same way an orange belongs on the Seder plate. And so now lots of people in the progressive world include an orange on the Seder plate because, of course, women do belong as rabbis and everything else in the world if they want to do it. They also had Palestinian olives to talk about all people who are downtrodden and oppressed. So I really, again, was struck by the immense wisdom and courage and hope that can be found in a Seder service. I served the congregation of Ludington, Michigan for a little while as a sabbatical minister. And they had a Seder service. And this was largely the production of one member and her friends. She was Jewish. She had a Jewish family, and she delighted in sharing this with her church family as well. And there were a bunch of us that did a ton of work, decorated things well, cooked the right ways, and then had the Seder meal and rituals. And that was, again, a really delightful, meaningful gathering that brought lots of joy to our lives. But each time I became more and more aware that I'm not really the right person to lead this kind of ritual. I am not Jewish. I don't have any relationship to Jewish culture. And so here, serving this congregation in South Bend, I have talked about Passover numerous times. I've talked about the elements of a Seder meal, but I'm not going to hold one. I think all of us long for peace in our lives. We just sang about that. Most of us want to feel at home somehow. And who doesn't want to be liberated from the various oppressions they experience in this world? The issues at the heart of the Passover meal speak to universal desires, but that Seder ritual is specific to the Jewish people, and it's been honed for that audience for over 2,000 years. I can learn from it. I don't think I can lead it. And a similar tangent here in our hymnal, the Singing the Living Tradition, number 151 is I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free. An amazing song written by Billy Taylor with lyrics that Billy and Dick Dallas put together. I wish I could break all these chains holding me. That's a very powerful metaphor. And again, it's an essentially universal human longing. We want to break the chains that hold us back. But when I say it, it's a metaphor. When that's a metaphor for everyone, then we can sing it loud, sing it clear for the whole world to hear. As long as it's a metaphor for me, but a lived reality for millions of my human cousins, then I feel uncomfortable singing it in our UU churches. You can do it with a lot of caveats and context setting, but frankly, it's just easier to find a piece of music from my own culture that speaks to that desire for liberation. When all of my Jewish cousins are no longer targeted and attacked or shot down near their places of worship, when the liberation that they're celebrating and singing about in a Seder meal is also only metaphorical, then I can imagine leading a Seder for a UU congregation again. Another tangent. In our UU Minister Facebook group this week, someone was talking about singing Spirit of Life and using the American Sign Language because these days we can't sing. Even if we are gathered together, we cannot sing because that exposes more people to the virus. So let's not sing. And if we're on Zoom, it's hard to sing together. So they thought about doing the signs for Spirit of Life in American Sign Language. And my colleague Liz Weber, who is trained in ASL, wrote, that's super well-intentioned, especially when we're not singing, but you'll be much better off if you make up a few gestures of your own. When non-deaf people try to learn ASL for a song, it gets mangled, and over time, it gets mangled to the point of gibberish. And I looked up some videos of UU choirs singing and signing Spirit of Life, and holy cow, is it mangled sometimes. It's really astonishing. Good intentions, but yikes. There is something to be said for involving movement in a service. More active engagement is good. The content sticks in our minds and hearts better. So it's good to make up some things and do them to keep our hands going, our bodies moving while our hearts are feeling and our brains are thinking. but we need to be clear about why we are doing it. I was part of a congregation once who paid an American Sign Language translator to sign the service every Sunday morning. That was about us feeling good about ourselves, telling us that we were being open and accessible and wonderful. It was not about making it accessible to deaf culture. We didn't advertise that anywhere in deaf culture. We didn't have any friends in the deaf community. We didn't do the other things that would welcome deaf folks to our congregation. We didn't have the relationships to know that American Sign Language is actually a point of contention in deaf culture and should be treated very carefully. Again, Reverend Weber says, stick with some generalized gestures and you'll be fine. They're easier to learn. They're still legit when they get changed by people, and they aren't problematic to actual deaf folks. That makes a ton of sense to me. And, this probably bringing up some ideas of, oh, there's cancel culture again, or the call out culture that Gail read from Diana Butler Bass. I'm weary of the call out culture. We need a call forth culture instead, calling forth the best in people. I get that. That's real. And Teresa Cooley's conflict happens because there's something we need to learn. Usually it's something we don't want to learn, or at least we have been resistant to learning. I guess I should own that. Usually when there's conflict, it's about something that I don't want to learn about myself. Here's a place where I've been called forth. The poetry of 14th century Persian speaking Muslim poet Muhammad Shams al-Din Hafez, as translated by Daniel Ladinsky. I love Hafez. I have a couple books of his poetry. I've got a set of note cards featuring his verses. I just eat that up. I've done a lot of services with some of that poetry. And recently I learned that very little of that is actually Hafez. According to an article by Omid Safi, the director of the Duke Islamic Studies Center, who writes, the poems that are ubiquitous on the internet are forgeries, fake, made up, no relationship to the original poetry of the beloved and popular Hafez of Shiraz. Safi writes, I want to give credit where credit is due. I do like Ladinsky's poetry, and they do contain mystics. Some of the statements that Ladinsky attributes to Hafez are in fact mystical truths we hear from many different mystics. And he is a gifted poet. This line, for example, I wish I could show you when you are lonely or in darkness, the astonishing light of your own being. That's good stuff, powerful. And many mystics, including the 20th century Sufi master Pir Vilayat, would cast his powerful glance at his students, stating that he longs for them to be able to see themselves and their own worth as he sees them. So yes, Ladinsky's poetry is mystical and it is great poetry. It's so good that it's listed on Goodreads as the wisdom of Hafez of Shiraz. The problem is Hafez of Shiraz said nothing like that. Daniel Ladinsky of St. Louis did. Ladinsky himself admitted they're not translations or accurate, and in fact denied having any knowledge of Persian in his 1996 best-selling book, I Heard God Laughing, which is in my library. Part of what's going on here is the voice and genius of the Persian-speaking Muslim, mystical, sensual sage of Siraj are usurped and erased and taken over by a white American with no connection to Hafez's Islam or any Persian tradition. This is erasure and spiritual colonialism. I still love the poetry. I still have the greeting cards, but I will cross out the name Hafez at the bottom and replace it with Ladinsky, and I will only send it to certain people. And I'm frustrated and sad by that. Some of us may have heard about the novel American Dirt last year. American author Janine Cummins wrote about the ordeal of a Mexican woman named Lydia who had to leave her home in Mexico and escape as an undocumented immigrant with her son to the United States. It got lots of great reviews. Oprah chose it for her book club. Mexican-American author Sandra Cisneros said it was great. And it seemed to be really gaining a lot of popularity and momentum. And Miriam Gerba was one of the first reviewers to give it a negative review. She wrote that for Ms. Magazine, who said, no, that's way too negative. We're not publishing that. So instead, Gerba put it on the academic blog Tropics of Meta. Gerba writes that Lydia is so shocked by her own country's day-to-day realities, gives the impression that Lydia might not be a credible Mexican. In fact, she perceives her own country as though through the eyes of a pearl-clutching American tourist. Another reviewer, David Bowles, called the book harmful, appropriating, inaccurate trauma porn. Author and critic Daniel Olivas wrote in an op-ed in the Guardian newspaper, American Dirt is an insult to Latinx writers who have toiled, some of us for decades, to little notice of major publishers and book reviewers while building a vast collection of breathtaking, authentic literature. I don't want to cancel Janine Cummins. I'm not calling out her publisher. I hope that I am calling forth most publishers and most of us reading public to seek out and support authentic Latin stories. One of the reasons I read is to learn about different people, different cultures, different times. If I'm really just reading another 21st century white person's ideas about those cultures, I'm not learning as much or as accurately as I thought I was. And that gets us back to Lincoln in the Bardo. There's a whole rich history of pulp novels from the 50s and 60s with these lurid covers and titillating titles, pandering to the human urges they claim to deplore. And blaxploitation films and all sorts of other artistic endeavors that make money off the suffering of real people while claiming to say it's about goodness. And I really think that Lincoln in the Bardo is in that realm. There are two scenes of violence in particular, one of them with a lot of sexual violence. They're unnecessary. They went on too long. It was voyeuristic. It didn't teach me a thing about the evils of slavery. It did teach me a little about the author, I think. If I want to learn more about slavery, I will read Toni Morrison or Colson Whitehead or Solomon Northup. I do not learn from more white people's understanding of this. We sang about joining our songs into a new sound in a full symphony. That's what we're trying to do in this world. And I want the songs of each person to be as authentic as possible. That's when we join them together in the symphony of life. It's a much more rich and deep understanding and a more beautiful song. So I guess on this Sunday, in this instance, I am calling forth myself. I call on myself to read the whole book before I suggest it to a congregation. I call on myself to seek out more authenticity, to do the research and learn about the author and the book, and not just picking from the latest top 10 lists. I call on myself to express deep compassion for all people, no matter if they agree or disagree with me. I call myself out and forth to listen to these people, and I call on myself to have the courage to speak my own truth quietly, humbly, and firmly. So may we be.